We are not normal. Yes, that means you. You are not normal. I, as you may have figured out, am not normal. We are not normal. Our friends, not normal. Our co-workers, not normal. Our family members, definitely not normal. Friends, we are not normal. Some of us even border on weird. We have our quirks, our idiosyncrasies, the things that we do that make no sense. We eat our meals in a counterclockwise way around our plate. We count steps in front of churches. We dress up like Superman well past the age when that would be considered normal. Fortunately for us, we come from a long line of abnormal people. As we may remember, our parents were not normal either. Nor, as it turns out, were their parents before them, or their parents before them, and so on and so forth. In fact, if we were to build a time machine, an admittedly abnormal thing to do, and used it to touch down at any moment or place in history, we would, without a doubt, find a population full of abnormal people. The truth is, friends, no matter how much the media, our peers, or our parents try to convince us otherwise, there is no such thing as normal. There is no such thing as normal. There is no average person. There is only us, flesh and blood, unique, particular, abnormal us. Not that the concept of normalcy isn't helpful. It helps us to know that we usually hold a fork with our fingers and not our toes. But it's not as if we can point to one particular person as normal. In other words, there is no average Joe. Certainly the last few weeks have reminded us of that. After all, we have been following along with a decidedly unaverage Joe. An abnormal Joseph, who had unique gifts and made unique mistakes, and who came from a long line of very unique people. For the past few months as a church, we have been focusing on the family of Abraham. From Abraham through Joseph. And if there is one common theme that has run throughout it all, it is that these people were not normal. And friends, that's good news. After all, it could have gone the other way. The Hebrew people who told these stories as a way of passing on the faith to their children could have chosen to tell stories about normal, average families. If that were the case, we might have heard the riveting tale of Abraham taking Isaac up the mountain for a haircut, or Jacob and Esau joining the wrestling team, or Joseph leaving his family to become an accountant. But that's not what they did. No. They told stories about abnormal people like us who did their best given their circumstances and made significant mistakes. For the past few months, we have heard stories of favoritism, of sibling rivalry, of cheating one another out of birthrights, of wrestling with men in the middle of the night, of names being changed and rechanged, and of people using sexual intimacy as a means of ignoring pain. And that, friends, was before we even got to Joseph. Most recently, we watched Joseph being favored by his dad, sold into slavery by his brothers, falsely accused by his master's wife, forgotten in jail by a cupbearer, and elevated to a position of power by Pharaoh. Again, this is not a normal family. And yet, throughout it all, through the intrigue, the backstabbing, and the favoritism, one constant has remained. friends, there is hope for us. Friends, there is hope for us, for crazy, abnormal us. After all, the Hebrew people who told these stories to their children were not normal either. Just like us, they made mistakes and did really stupid things that ended up causing pain to those around them. And yet, they somehow understood that God was present with them despite those things. They understood that they didn't have to fit into some average mold to be a child of God. No, they were part of God's family, whether they liked it or not. And let's face it, if there's one thing we know for sure about families, it is that nobody's is normal. And in case there were any doubt about the craziness God would love us through, they told stories like the one about the family of Abraham. In other words, they were saying, if God could love that family, then all of us have hope. And so with that in mind, let us hear one last story from that crazy family as we listen together for a reminder about what this whole thing is about. Some will remember that when we left Joseph last week, he was being a bit of a jerk to his brothers. There was a famine in all of the land, and Joseph was in charge of all the grain stockpiles of Egypt, the only source of food for all of the people in the surrounding region. And in that capacity, his brothers had come to him seeking food. Joseph, not revealing himself as their brother and speaking through an interpreter, chooses to start to mess with his brothers. He threw them in jail, he forced them to go and bring back their youngest brother, and twice he gave them grain only to put their money back into their sacks, not so that they wouldn't have to pay, but so that he could accuse them of stealing. Most recently, just before our passage, he also upped the ante a bit and put in a silver cup so that he could throw them in jail, perhaps even get them executed. In other words, if this is starting to sound a little like a soap opera, you're right. This is juicy. And Joseph has been orchestrating it all. He's been sitting back and watching his brothers squirm and loving it, at least appearing to love it. You see, there's some evidence that all of this intrigue has taken its toll on Joseph. Throughout the chapters that record the ways in which he messed with his brothers, there are several instances of Joseph being overcome with emotion. Several times we're told that Joseph had to take a moment to weep. And while it might seem strange at first, given that he was the one perpetrating these things, we know from our experience that it kind of makes sense. After all, getting even rarely leaves us feeling good. Perhaps this is why Jesus asked us to practice forgiveness. Maybe he knew it was the only way, the only sure way that we could find our way back to life, to find ourselves whole again. Maybe he understood that revenge, no matter how well executed, always leaves us broken. And maybe Joseph, in this moment, recognized that too. Joseph sends his guards away so that no one would be there when he revealed his true identity to his brothers. And once the guards leave the room and he's standing there in front of these men, Joseph begins to cry. fact, before he even says a word to his brothers, we are told he wept so loudly that all the Egyptians and the entire house of Pharaoh heard it. And if we're honest, we get this too. After all, we know that when we finally confront those painful parts of our lives, emotions can run high. We know that when we have spent so much time bottling up our anger, our pain, our sins, our brokenness, when it finally comes out, it can be loud. And friends, that's okay. Through the weeping, we're told that Joseph says to his brother, finally not using an interpreter, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" We might imagine his brothers at this point would have been a little freaked out. After all, they had just had this governor of Pharaoh's court put them through the ringer, and then send his guards away, and then break down in tears in front of them. That's weird enough. But then he goes on to say that he's their long-lost brother and wants to know about his dad. That's not normal. Perhaps this explains why they were silent. Must have taken a moment for that revelation to set in. For them to move in their minds from the wrongs that had been done to them over the past few days to the wrong that they did so many years ago. It's hard to face those truths. And in that moment, we might imagine there would have been more tears. Joseph beckons them closer and says, "I am your brother, whom you sold to Egypt." In other words, he acknowledges what they did to him. He names the source of distress among them and then offers them comfort. He says, "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God set me before you to preserve life." God sent me before you to preserve life. Do you hear? Somehow, through his pain, his mistakes, his bumblings, Joseph has managed to figure out what this whole thing is about. God sent me before you to preserve life. Somehow he realizes that his God-given task, wherever he is, whatever the circumstance, is to preserve life. And friends, the same goes for us. We are a people who believe in life, who proclaim life not just upon death, but right now. And whatever else we are called to do, we have a mission to preserve life, fullness of life. That's what we mean when we say feed more sheep. And it begins by accepting one another in all our abnormalities. All of them. Remember the words of Jesus, "I came that you may have life and have it abundantly." That's what this whole thing is about. Will we do it in the same way as everyone else? No. There is no normal way to do it. But it starts by recognizing what God has given us to do it with. And who God has given us to do it with. The good news is we don't have to do it alone. Friends, God is present with us as we attempt to bring life to the world. And as we have been reminded from our study of that very abnormal family of Abraham, we don't have to do it perfectly. We just have to do it. The truth is, we will all make mistakes in our attempts to feed more sheep, in our attempts to preserve life, but that doesn't mean we have to stop trying or that we won't have highs and lows. Certainly Joseph is an example. This was quite a moment for Joseph, admitting his wrongs, practicing forgiveness and reorienting his mission for the preservation of life. But after this, he was far from perfect. In fact, in these short 5 chapters that remain in his story, Joseph not only convinces his family to move to Egypt, but brings the rest of the people of Canaan as well, which wouldn't be so bad. But as the famine continues and people can't pay, he makes them sell their livestock and then eventually their freedom. In other words, Joseph is the one who convinces his people to sell themselves into slavery. And we know that doesn't work out so well. But the good news for Joseph, and indeed the good news for us, is that God's work in the world of preserving life does not end with us. There are others. God is bigger than our failings and will continue to find ways of preserving life even when we totally blow it. Will God always work through normal people? No. We have to find one first. But we do know that God will be at work. That God will be working with us and through us for life. And friends, being children of a God like that means that no matter how hard we try, we will never